Oh hey, today I'm going to show you how to take an outdrive off. This is going to be an Alpha 1, so tag along and see how we do it. Okay, so this is going to apply to basically the smaller Mercruiser outdrives. This is an Alpha 1, there's an Alpha 1 Gen 2, there's also, it's basically the same for the older stuff. I don't know that a lot of those are in service anymore, but they're like called MR drives or ones, outdrive 1 or whatever. Anyways, it's basically all the same stuff is going to apply. Now the reason why you'd want to take your outdrive off is to inspect inside here. There's U-joints, also the gimbal bearing that's up in here that I'll show you. So we want to get up in there to inspect that, as well as the bellows. There's a rubber bellows, and if those bellows go bad, basically what happens is your boat takes on water and down she goes. So that's why I'm taking mine off. I just want to make sure the U-joints are good, and I want to inspect the gimbal bearing before we get going really any farther on this boat. So that's what I'm going to do now. So basically all you're going to need, I may need a screwdriver or a pry bar at some point, and I'll show you why. But really all you're going to need is on this one anyways, a 5/8 socket. And probably an extension for your ratchet. I'm just going to use my impact just to make it a little bit easier. So a 5/8 socket and wrench. Sometimes they might have a 9/16 on one of these studs, or sometimes on the older ones, I think it was a 9/16 on these, basically your trim bolts. So the first thing I'm going to take off is my trim bolts. Now I can tell by the way that the boat is sitting, and just for doing this a long time, I'm going to have to lower the nose of the boat down, because when this comes down, basically what we want to be able to do is swing the outdrive all the way down, and if possible not have the skeg, the bottom of the outdrive, touch the ground. It'll just help us when we're pulling this off. So I'm going to go lower the front of the boat, and then we'll take the trim off. So hopefully that'll do it for us, because I'm down as low as I can on my tongue jack. I mean, I could flip it down, put it all the way down the ground, but I'm not going to bother doing that. Now, when you take these off, you actually don't need to pull the whole thing out. And sometimes it can be pretty tough to get both. This is a big rod that goes through the top here and at the bottom. So sometimes it can be really tough to get that rod all the way out. So what I do is I will just pull off one side, but what I'll do is I'll leave the bottom on. I'll leave one trim cylinder basically on. I'll just slide it out of the way a little bit, and I'll pull the rod out of the other side. So let me show you how I do that. Okay, so it's just taking the one nut off of this one, and then on our bottom here, I'm going to take the nut off of this opposite side. So these caps just unscrew. Shouldn't be on there too tight. So I'll take that nut off, pull my washer off. Now let's see how tight this is. Okay, so got this side off. Try to pull that out a bit. Now what you don't want to do is have one of your cylinders go lower than the other. That'll be a bit of a pain when you go to take it back out. So now I'm going to pull the bottom off of this side, hopefully. Yep. Pull my pin out. Now I can drop that down. And be very careful, don't pinch your fingers. There, so now it's sitting on the ground. So, let me show you here what I did. So you can see I left the pin in that side, and I left the pin in on that side and just pulled it out just a touch. So the pin is still in at the back, and this trim cylinder is completely off with the pin still in the front. That's going to make it a lot easier when I go to put this back together, that I'm not trying to fight to get that rod all the way through, or both rods all the way through. So it's just an easier way of doing it. So one very important thing to remember is the drive must be in forward. So I shifted it into forward, but just so I know, when I move the prop to the left, it'll be stuck. It won't turn, okay? But it ratchets to the right. That's forward. Ratchet to the right, stop to the left is forward. So it has to be in forward because there's a little shift pawl up underneath that is straight when it's in forward, and in any other gear it's sideways, and if you try to get it off or ram it back on when it's not in forward, you will bend that. The other thing too you want to make sure is that you have a new gasket. Never try to reuse the old gasket, because I can pretty well guarantee you, unless it's been off just recently, like off and back on again, or back on and back off, you're going to tear that gasket. Okay, last one. Now, as I said, it is easier when the drive goes past and doesn't hit the ground, because what you can do is often swing the drive down just slightly and have it hit, and it will just pop itself off. So we'll see how easy this is going to be. If it's been off recently, it won't be too difficult. So get that other trim cylinder down and out of the way, and we'll just try to give this a shake and see if it's going to come off. Oh yeah, not bad at all. There we go. Okay. So here we go. So this is why we take it off, so that we can get into these U-joints, and actually these look like they're new. They look fairly new. They've been greased before. So there's O-rings on here, and sometimes another one on them, but this one just has 2 O-rings there. So you always want to make sure you replace those, and they seal inside the gimbal bearing, which is up inside here. Now you can see that gasket is split just right there. There's also another O-ring for your water inlet. So this is where your water comes in through, right there. So that's where your water inlet is going to be. Man, oh man, look at that junk. Huh. That's interesting. So this is your shift here. Okay, so that's your shift that lines up, and on the back of here, spin this around. So right in here is your shift shaft, right there, okay? So when you go to put this back on, you need to make sure that this is straight. And sometimes it can be a bit tricky, but when we put the drive back on, I'll show you how that goes. So it's a good idea too, we will clean up these splines, but just check your splines to see if they look really worn. Run your finger on it, and if there's a groove in them, then maybe time to replace this shaft and your engine coupler. There is a tiny bit of a groove on this, but nothing that's overly concerning, being the age of the boat. Alright, so this is our gimbal housing, and so what we want to inspect is the bellows, just to see if there's any cracks in the bellows. It's actually easier to do on the outside, but if you saw a bunch of junk or water and stuff in here, it's a good indication that something is wrong. Now I can tell you right now that this boat has had the drive in the up position for quite a long time, because you can see that wants to spring up. So this boat's been with its drive up for quite a long time. Now, just one thing I want to note. So the exhaust bellows down here is broken, and that doesn't matter. First of all, this boat has through hull exhaust that come out the bottom of the platform here. So that's capped off on the inside. But no matter what, that exhaust doesn't go up and inside the boat. So there's no way for it to leak inside if the exhaust bellows is broken. Actually, some of the earlier Alphas, they just had a hose that came out and made contact here with your gimbal housing, your outer bell housing, if you will. It just was a hose that slid over. So if your exhaust is split, that's not a big deal. Your water hose, you want to turn the drive, get in there and inspect the water hose, which I've already done. This water hose is actually a little bit hard and getting a bit older. But now what we want to do is make sure our hands are clean. So you don't want any sand or grit or anything in your hand. And just reach up in there and feel that gimbal bearing, turn it around. And this one is fairly smooth, could stand to be greased. I mean, there's a ton of grease in there, but it could definitely stand to be greased. But this gimbal bearing is good. Now, if you turn the bearing and it felt, chunky and bumpy as you turn it around, that would be no good. So everything in here looks good. I'll go ahead and grease. Now on the side here, on this far side, so over here is our grease fitting that shoots grease up into the gimbal bearing. So we want to make sure we grease here. There's another one up the top here, right up the top here. So we want to make sure we get grease on that because that's for our steering shaft at the top, and then we'll grease our U-joints. Okay, so we're continuing on here with our lower unit, and what I'm going to do is a water pump replacement. So on this you've got 5 nuts to take off, one at the very back, 2 on the sides here, 1 on either side, 2 up underneath. Then you have a hex, 3/8 hex socket or Allen bolt that holds the water pump skeg on, so you will need a large hex head, and I'll show you that. So once you get all those off, then up underneath the anode is another bolt, and it is, I think it's 9/16. Yeah. No. Oh. This one's a socket as well. Okay, I'm gonna go grab my... Okay, so I happen to have a 3/8 socket for my ratchet. So that's what I will go ahead and use, but if you don't... Well, what in the world? What size is that now? 5/16. All right. All right. So it's been a while since I've done one of these. Yeah, 5/16. So 3/8 up here, 5/8 on the sides. This one happens to be a 5/8 socket underneath. I think that bolt underneath could also be a 1/2-inch bolt. Anyways, we'll get this off of here, and hopefully the drive will come apart. Now I'm using this big 1/2-inch ratchet because I'm too lazy to walk out to my truck and get my good 3/8 one. It happens to be in my truck at the moment. What in the world? That was weird. Weird. Ew. Grungy. Oh. Okay. Now the two halves should come apart. Come on. There we go. Push. 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 Pushy. Pushy. What's so stuck here? Come on. Oh, I know it's stuck. My nuts. Yeah, you can't get these nuts off until you get it all the way up. Probably stuck a thread. Come on. There we go. One. Yeah. There we go. And off she comes. All right, nice and grungy. Set this down over here. Okay, look. So this is also part of the reason. So you can see I'm gonna have to look up inside the other side, filled with mousers. So this boat sat for quite a while, and obviously was home to some critters. And we hope, I hope, but that's probably why all that junk is in there, in the exhaust portion. So I'll clean all that out. So when I get this off, what I like to do is I like to just have a quick look around and make sure that this doesn't look all warped and bent, and that would mean that it would have been overheated. And this one here is not. It's still in nice shape. Bring it in here. So it's all still a nice shape. It's not all distorted, doesn't look bubbled or anything. So that tells me that this hasn't been overheated, so that's good. So let me get my new water pump parts and the tools, and we'll get this apart. So let's talk quickly here about water pump impellers and what is out there for you to buy. So typically what I recommend buying is either Quicksilver, Sierra, or better yet, Mercruiser. Now, when I was in the trade and used to do this all the time, they actually switched their water pump impellers instead of a brass insert to fiberglass. I think the Sierra one is still brass. Anyways, I took a chance on Amazon and looked up a water pump impeller and thought, you know what, it's pretty cheap, let's get it and see what it's like. On the picture, it showed a brass impeller, which it did have, so it came with that, so that's nice. I like the fact that it's got a brass impeller, and the impeller looks pretty good. Comes with a little tube to go up the top. Comes with O-rings. Now, these little green gaskets in here are supposed to be for the drive screws, the gear lube screws. And I wouldn't use those. Stay away from the fiber ones. I'll show you the ones that I use in a minute. But, you know, it's got the O-rings and whatever else you might need in there, because there's this O-ring on here and there's an O-ring on the drive shaft up here. It's got the stainless steel base plate and all the various gaskets you'll need. So that's pretty decent. However, I come up to the housing here and the insert comes out and it wobbles around. Now, I don't like that. The housing up here, this housing, I have a Quicksilver kit here as well, so let me show you that. So the upper housing, the plastic is just slightly different on this Quicksilver one, and you can see my stainless cup here is solid inside of there, where this one rocks around and moves. So I don't like that. I would never use that on something. I guess maybe in a pinch, but I'd almost rather just reuse the old one than use one that moved around like that, because if this ever spun, what's going to happen is it's going to cause a big issue, because this is actually offset in here, and if it spins and gets cocked in the wrong way, you can actually cut into your drive shaft here, and anyways, it's just a bad news. However, I do like the impeller from this one, being that the impeller is brass. So on this Quicksilver one, also comes with all your different gaskets, O-rings, the base plate for the bottom, your little plastic tube, and here is the impeller in that, and it's fiberglass. Now I've never had an issue with these. I have used them quite a bit, but I just don't know why. I mean, it's fiberglass or something. I don't know. It's some type of a plastic or something. But anyways, it's no longer brass. So I'm going to use the brass one. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use this impeller inside the Quicksilver cup. I'll put that back in the box there. So in the back here, you can see this one here, this Quicksilver kit. The O-rings or gaskets for the drive screws are the yellow gaskets. I don't know if you can see that. So these yellow gaskets in here are a nice yellow gasket. So another thing that I noticed now too, between the cheapy kit and the Quicksilver one, is in my little bag here, which I'm used to, it actually comes with, there's a new keyway for the impeller. So there's a new keyway in there. There's the bolt, this little bolt that goes on the end that you'll see when I pull it out. And a couple other O-rings and stuff. There's actually, if your drive uses a pin, there's a pin in there. Anyways, that's kind of cool. So, moral of the story is go with Quicksilver or Mercury, or even the Sierra one is not bad. But yeah, if you can, if it's a Mercruiser outdrive that you have, go with the Mercruiser stuff, Quicksilver, Sierra. If it's an OMC outdrive or a Volvo, go with the OEM recommended stuff. But again, Sierra, if that's all you can get, is pretty good stuff as well, or even Quicksilver. Quicksilver is basically Mercury Marine's aftermarket brand. So let's carry on here, get my tools to get this cup off, and we'll get going. So I will notice too, so this, typically this brass tube stays in the upper housing. It can pull out, but it should stay in the upper housing. Anyways, we'll just shove that. I'll make sure that that's back up in there when we put this back together. All right. So let's get this housing off of here and see what our impeller looks like. Oh, first I want to take apart, sorry. First I want to get this O-ring off. I'll take the top one off. Put that over there. Take this one off. So I can tell already that this probably hasn't been changed for a while, because this rubber washer, gasket, O-ring, whatever you want to call it, is all weather cracked on the top. So this hasn't been replaced for quite a while, so it'll be interesting to see what this looks like inside of here. Oh, grabbed the wrong one. But I've got a wrench. I'll just use the wrench. So the one on the end here is a 5/16 to get this funky bolt out. Big coarse bolt. Okay. That's pretty bent. All right, now next, these 7/16 nuts. Okay, so we're gonna pry this off. Came off pretty good. So there's that little keyway I was talking about, so make sure you don't drop that down in there. So I'll take the old one out, lift this right out, and there's my impeller. And actually, looks not too bad. So this one would have been all right. There's not, I'll show you on the inside. It's not too bad, it's not too cracked, but yeah, this is a brass one, so it hasn't been replaced for quite a while. So pay attention when you take this off, but this spins clockwise, and so does your impeller. So just, you want to know that, and I'll show you when we're putting this back together, but just remember, so this went on like this, right? And take a look at it. The impeller blades are bent this way, which means it spins clockwise, and I'll show you why I say that in a minute. But let's take this out so that you can see. Yeah, this impeller's not too bad, but so you can see what happens over time as they sit, especially when they sit for a long period of time. The blades get bent over almost in a permanent orientation. This is why I'm changing this, because I knew this boat sat. So So what happens is when it will come into that open part of the impeller housing here, what'll happen is that blade that is not pushed over as much is not going to squeeze as tight on the side. Now this is offset, and so there's going to be a little bit of a gap. Actually, I can show it to you right now. When I pull that over, I don't know if you can see that when I pull that straight in there, there's actually a gap in there. So that's not pumping as much water as it should be. So that's why we're replacing this water pump impeller. So now, like I said, if for some reason, I mean, you had that kit or whatever you had and the cup was moving, I could reuse this cup. It's not too bad. It's not all bent and distorted, but I've got a new one, so I'm going to use the new one. So some kits will also come with, there's a plastic, I don't want to drop any of this junk in there. So there's a plastic housing on the bottom here that some of them will come with, and there's a gasket in there as well. Don't replace that. If the kit that you buy comes with that bottom housing, and if your housing still looks good like this one does, it's not warped or distorted, what'll happen in this little spot here, the skinny part, it will sometimes get distorted and burnt when this is overheated. But this one's still really good. And I recommend you, even when they are burnt, I usually don't replace them unless it's really bad. Oh, I just dropped junk in there. Because there's a seal on the other side of this, and if you don't get this seated down properly, you'll have a water leak in there. So make sure you get all that old gasket material off, and you can see this is just crumbling in my hand. So you can tell, again, like I said, how old that actually is. So unfortunately, I don't have the other one just disintegrated in my hand, but we will go through here and I can pretty much tell there should only be one. Yeah, there is. So this is going to be my bottom gasket, which is going to go like this. Nope. The other way. There's two locating pins here. I'll go the other way so that will match up with the locating pin. What is going on? Is this? No, it's just fuzz. Okay. Drop that on. And just be careful not to rip that. So that sits down like that. Then we take our base plate, which matches up with the gasket, and those locating pins just like that. Should push on. There we go. Now we're going to take our upper gasket, which again is going to match all of them. These other ones are for the older different style. They don't have the same locating sort of hoop in them that all the rest of them do. So I'll drop this on like this. Put that down. Now we're going to use that, like I said, that brass impeller and the, where is it, Quicksilver housing. So what I like to do, and I don't have, unfortunately with me, you can really kind of use any kind of grease on this, and I like to lube this up because especially if it's going to be a couple days maybe before I am going to start this up. I hate starting these up dry. Sure, when you put the water to it, it'll shoot up in there, but it still starts a little bit dry. So what I typically like to use is white grease. Now the only white grease that I have, I usually have a little container of it, but the only white grease I have is this in a spray container. So I'm just going to spray some of this in here. You don't need a ton. And so I just put some in there, and I'm going to smear it around with my hand. And the other thing I do is I take a little dab of this to stick this on, and I use the grease to stick that keyway on. Okay, so I'll slide my impeller down over top of here. Now remember, this goes clockwise. So I'm going to take my impeller housing over the top, stop here, and spin this clockwise as I push down. And there we go. now that's on. Seat it all the way down, give it a good spin. Grab a rag. Okay, so put our nuts back on. Our washers, don't forget the washers. And I'm a bit of a stickler for washers. I always put there's always a flat and a round side to washers. And I always put the rounded side up towards the nut and the flat side down. I don't know, it's just how I've always done stuff. Now, out of my kit here, I'm going to pull that new bolt out, because oftentimes what happens too is people over tighten this coarse bolt, and that's why they get bent. And I don't know if you noticed, I'm using just my, wherever I put it, where'd it go? There it is. I just used my quarter drive ratchet on this. None of this stuff needs to be extremely tight. These nuts have lock washers on, or they're lock nuts, so they don't have to be ridiculously tight. Just tighten it down a bit like that at first. Oh, need my other one. Okay, so I just snug these up. They don't have to be ridiculously tight. There we go. Okay, now, because I have a wrench for this, I will just use my wrench. It's only a few turns anyways. There, okay. Now my new tube is here, my little alignment tube. Now we need to put our gasket over the top of here, which is just sort of our extra seal. So that goes on like this. Okay. And then our O-ring on the drive shaft, like that. Now, one thing that I like to do, and you don't have to use, so I like to put grease on the splines of my shift shaft here, and definitely on my drive shaft. So, Mercury sells, and I've just always used it, they sell engine coupling spline grease, and it's just a bit of a thicker, stringier grease, and that's what I've always used. That's what I was taught to use and sort of always still have. So that's what I'll keep using, but you don't have to by any means. Whatever grease you have will work. And all it does is it just protects these splines from getting really jarred up, because they do take a lot of abuse jarring around. And we'll put some on the shift shaft. Okay, so now we're ready to put the two to put the halves back together. I got my new anode in, and one thing to note on these anodes is the standard, if you have a finned anode and you're using basically a larger prop like this, a stainless prop, sometimes what will happen is they will hit that standard anode. So this one here, I slide this forward. So this anode here is meant to go out and extend past that prop so it doesn't hit. If you had the standard one, it would definitely hit this prop. And what I've done in the past is I'll just go in and cut the fin off. But I just ordered one with the fin that's extended and dropped back. Again, I'll put the link down below for Amazon for the Quicksilver part number and link to that. Unfortunately, the bolt that comes with it is the newer style that is a 1/2-inch bolt, and it won't fit with my older style gear case, so I'm just gonna reuse this bolt. It doesn't hold much on. These don't have to be crazy tight. Like it's literally just holding that anode on. Obviously, you don't want that anode to come off because you can wreck the prop, but if you just drop that in there and tighten it up decent, you know, don't have to, again, tighten it down much. The new ones come with Loctite on it. I don't have any blue Loctite. I've only got red, and I don't want to put red on that because I'll never get the bolt back off. So I'll just make sure it's good and tight, and that's it. So let's get these two halves back together and get this drive back on the boat. So one more thing I want to note that I just remembered. In here, so on this side here is our passageway for the oil to go through in the two halves, and there is a little O-ring or gasket in there. And that's another good reason to buy this Quicksilver impeller kit, because it comes with that new gasket, the new little O-ring. It's orange coated, and so just get your pick. Pick out the old one, just like that. Throw it on the floor, and just clean that boss out a little bit. Make sure there's no... Last person, I guess, used a little bit of sealant or glue. There's a bellows glue, whatever. I guess they were worried about it coming out, so I'll just pick some of that bellows glue out. And we'll just set that in there. Come on. There we go. So just set that in there, and now we're good to go to put these halves back together. Ooh. Put your hand up in there. You can actually see through the hole in the back. Come on. There we go. Make sure your shift is lined up properly. Which I am not. Oh, shoot. Pliers. So what's happening is I'm not in forward, so I will have to grab my pliers wherever they are. Okay, so now I'm in forward, and everything is clockwise for forward. So, oh, now I got to get that tube out of there. Right. Are you gonna work? No, pushing it even farther in. Come on. Ah! Sugar. Now it's right down in there. Ah, I gotta pull the prop off. Maybe I can shake it upside down, I don't know. Now, how am I going to get that out of there? I've never done that before in my life. Never done that. It's just because you guys are watching that I did that. Man, oh man. So, a little tip for getting props off is just put a chunk of wood against the cavitation plate here, against the bottom. And then when you're taking it off, it'll make it a heck of a lot easier for you than trying to actually hold the prop. Now this prop nut was pretty loose, so it's not really a good thing. these stainless steel props can be pretty sharp, so that's why you don't really want to be using your hand to grab a hold of this. I've sliced myself on them before, so using that piece of wood until you get it relatively loose is a good, safe idea. Well, there you go. I mean, it doesn't get more real world than that. I've done hundreds and hundreds of these. I can't even tell you how many of these I've done. I've never done that. Figures, the one time I'm trying to do it for YouTube and show you guys some tips, but there you go. So I had to pull the prop off, used a little wire to kind of fish it up in and get it back out of there, because I don't think I would have ever got that through there. It's just too tight. I mean, I guess I might have, but either way, I'm mangling this thing. Luckily, the old one was still good. It's not all melted, so I can just use the old one in this. I've got a few spare old ones as well. I usually keep all that stuff just in case. But anyways, happens to all of us. An old one in there. And yeah, let's try this again. Make sure my bolt's in there. Oh, now I got to put it in forward. So I want to have that straight. This little guy here. Want to have this thing straight. So again, you can see in through the back to try and guide your everything down. There we go. And there we go. I just have to give this a turn. There we go. Okay, we're in. Just check. Yep, we're good. We're in forward. All right, now we can start putting our bolts and nuts back on here and get this sucker back on the boat. All right, so now I'm ready to put gear lube back in this thing and almost ready to put it back on the boat. One quick tip before I go ahead and do this. You want to make sure that the old gaskets are out of the hole. So I take a pick, you can take a small screwdriver. I always just take a pick and get in there and pop them out. And typically I'll take a small flat bladed screwdriver and just scrape this surface off, because what they used to use is these old fiber washers, and the fiber washer would get stuck in the housing and part of it would get stuck or whatever, and then people put a new washer on, slime it back in, sometimes not even put washers on. And most common place for a drive to leak water in is those screws. So you want to make sure that that sealing surface is good and clean and you've gotten those old gaskets out of there. So as you can see, my old gaskets were in there. I'll just take the screwdriver, and especially this one because people seem to not be able to see that one. And I'll just give it a scrape and make sure it's clean. And always, 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 they're so cheap, just use new drive screw gaskets and make sure you're getting the good ones, these blue ones. I find I like them the best. So you want to make sure that you're using good gear lube in these. I always run either the Quicksilver or Mercury high performance gear lube. I run that in all my gear cases, even if it's just a tiny little 9.9 or whatever. I always run the high performance gear lube. It's just so much better. Yeah, Mercury high performance gear lube, either the Quicksilver or the Mercury, they're both the same. Just depends on where you buy it from, what they have in stock. So the one that I had previously was Quicksilver, and now my other one is Mercury. These outdrives will typically take about 1.5 of these jugs, maybe almost 2, but I mean this is a good test because we've got 2 full jugs. It's often what happens is I couldn't tell you because I often don't have a full jug. The outboard lower units only take about half of a jug depending on how much you drain out, and the larger ones anyways. So I always end up having a partial bottle sitting around, but this is 2 full bottles, so we'll be able to tell. And the drive was completely empty. So away we go and pump away. All right, so we've switched over to our second bottle, and try not to pump too much air into this thing, trying to suck the last out of the bottom. It'll just make it more difficult when you're trying to fill it, because that air has to work its way all the way up and out that vent. So try not to pump too much air in these things. There we go. And she's coming out. So that took basically one and, I don't know, just the very top of this bottle, and that drive was completely empty. So you can almost get away with one, but I always tell people to buy two for these Mercruisers. I just usually give it a little bit of an extra pump. You see, just let it flow out a bit. Watch for air bubbles coming out. And that's it. I'll put my screw back in. So you put the top screw in first. Backwards to the bottom. When you do the bottom, like when you're draining it, you always take the bottom screw out first, then take the top one out. When you're putting it back in and fill it up, put the top one in, and then take the bottom one out. Now, I used to have a really nifty drive screw from Snap-on that was a nice little short, big, wide screwdriver. Somebody, I don't know, got legs one day and walked away, I guess. Most likely I forgot it somewhere. Okay, put the bottom screw in. Yeah, you're going to get messy, but it is what it is. If your screw is starting to strip out too, if you notice that the screw is the edges of that, basically your indent there, aren't as nice and sharp, go buy a new screw. The screws are really cheap too, so go ahead and do that. So now this drive, what I'll do is I'll put new O-rings on here, put some lube, some spline grease on our spline here, and it's ready to go back on the boat. Oh, one more thing I'm going to do is take off this goofy fin. I'm not quite sure why it's there. Someone's cut it down. It's one of those wider fins, and I don't know why it's on there. I don't know if I believe if they actually work. Sorry if, you know, but I don't really know if they work or not, especially on a boat like this. Sometimes what they're supposed to do is help a boat plane out a little bit better, but this is a 20-foot boat with a 5.7 in it, 350, and a decent prop on it. So, I mean, this thing's going to go pretty good and plane out pretty well. It's got a lot of power, even loaded with people. I mean, typically a boat this size would have a 4.3 in it, V6. So we're going to have just enough power, so I'm going to take that off. Okay, now for the prop. So what I like to do is just make sure this is nice and clean. And typically at the end of the season, I will pull the prop off. I didn't do this one last year. This boat was new to me and I haven't used it yet. So I just like to go through and clean some of this grease, old grease and stuff off of this prop shaft and out of the splines. Just clean it up a little bit, make it look nice. And so the first thing to go on obviously is your washer. So we'll make sure that's good and clean. And I just like to put a little bit on here for my washer. And again, you can use any grease. I just happen to have this spline grease. It's a really thick, heavy, sticky grease. You don't want to use this stuff in bearings or any of that, but it's specifically meant for splines to be good and sticky to help those splines out. So I just put a little bit on the back like that, slide my washer on. Now I'll do the splines. And again, this just protects all these splines, stops them from wearing out, because they do take a lot of force. You know what? While my finger is dirty, let's do the drive shaft as well. So same thing on the drive shaft, but what you want to do first, let's wipe a little bit of this off. So what you want to do first here is take your O-rings off and put your new O-rings on. Let's do the back one first, because then it'll slip over the front one. O-ring, gone. O-ring, gone. Now let's clean all this up. So here I spend a little bit more time trying to clean out these splines just to make sure there's less dirt and gunk in them. Yeah, these are pretty crusty. Okay, it's got that. So now I'll go ahead and put my new O-rings on before I grease it up, because you'll just wipe all that grease off. Let's get into my drive gasket kit. Again, Quicksilver. I'll put a link down below. Got this off of Amazon. The front one on first, then you can push the other one up over top of it. And put this off to the side for now. Now, time to get dirty again. Good amount of spline grease. This is where it's really important. So I'll get it on there. I put a little bit on my O-rings to make them slide in. So these seat in the gimbal bearing, which is up inside that I showed you before. So I put the prop back on because it helps me when I'm putting this drive on to keep it in drive, and to also turn the drive shaft to get those spline stall line up. The newer style lock washers are a little bit flimsier, and they've got a nice little hole in them and you can actually, I can anyways, pry them with my fingers. These old ones are a bit of a pain in the butt, but I kind of like them because they're really sturdy. But they can just be, they're more of a pain to get off than they are to put on. So I just make sure that these are all straight. Helps me spin this on. And one thing that I see happen quite a bit is the nut gets sideways in this lock washer. People start putting this on and the nut gets sideways. I'm going to show you a trick to keep this seated in the center of this lock washer. I mean, if it's sideways, it's not really doing anything. So you want this seated in the base of the lock washer, and I'll show you what I do as a trick to help out with that. So I start threading this on. And it is a lock nut, so it's going to stop at some point and get hard once it hits that lock nut part. So what I do now, as soon as it gets hard, I pull the prop forward. I don't know if you can see that. So I pull the prop forward so that that nut is sitting properly in that base. Okay. Now again, be careful with these stainless steel props because they can be sharp. But I pull it forward, the nut is seated properly in that washer, and I hold it forward as I'm tightening it so that that washer spins with the nut. Then you're not going to get that all sideways and cockeyed. So we'll just tighten it down until we get close. Now it's going to stay, it's not going to go anywhere. Again, this is very sharp. You can really cut your hand with these stainless props. So, I'll get my chunk of wood out again, wedge it in there. Now I don't have to worry about it. And you do want these pretty tight. I look at my lock washer, make sure I got my spline, so I'm snug. I'm going to go a little bit more, and there we go. Now I can lock those tabs down. I'm going to use a hammer to tap this in. So now we want to get our housing ready for our drive to go back on. And so we're going to have to pull this old gasket off and make sure we clean the surface off. And we're going to have to get this O-ring out. Sometimes these gaskets can be pretty stuck on. The O-ring, that just popped right off. And I'll show you a trick about that in a minute. Just clean this out. All right, let's see if we can get this gasket off nicely. Nope. So we'll just take a razor blade and scrape the remaining gasket off of here. Make sure not to drop a whole bunch of chunks inside the actual housing. Now for the O-ring that goes in here, there's a couple things you can do to stop it from falling back off, because if you just place it in there, it's going to fall back out. So you can take a tiny bit of grease and plop it in there, and the grease should hold this in. But I happen to have gasket glue, so I'm going to put a little bit of gasket glue on there. Some guys will put the bellows adhesive on there, just a tiny little dab, and you don't need much. Don't go crazy. Just put a tiny little dab of whatever you've got. Like I said, grease will work. But I just do a dab at the top, dab at the bottom, and then stick that on my hull and just let that seal up for a minute before I go ahead and do anything. So you've also got this other large O-ring, and that's going to go inside of here. So I'll take some paper towel, shop rag, whatever you got, and I'll clean this out a bit. You'll find typically when the drive comes out that this is actually on the drive, but this is where it actually goes. It's up in there, and just make sure it's seated all the way down. Perfect. If you want to go crazy, you can wipe some of that grease out of there, but no thanks. So the other thing you can do now while the drive is off is I'm going to go ahead and grease up my grease points on this. Now there is a mercury grease, but a good quality wheel bearing grease, or whatever chassis grease you might have for a car, whatever. But if you're just doing a boat, go ahead and pick up some of the mercury stuff. So the first thing I do is my gimbal bearing, because I like to be able to see in there, and you should be able to see this start to squish out. Yeah. Perfect. You can never have too much on that gimbal bearing. Now these trim pins, bell housing pins. What was that, a cap on it? Yeah, take the cap off. Oh, good. And our steering. Okay, now we're good to go. Now we're ready to go ahead and put our drive gasket on. Now there is an extra O-ring in here. I don't know what it's for. Now this is not enjoyable. I never have a good time doing this. You got a lot of things to do. Make sure it's in forward, so you got to make sure before you go and slam this thing in here that this is in the right spot. Okay, make sure your shift mechanism is all in the good spot. This one's nicely greased up, so I'm not going to bother putting any more grease on there. Your shifter is on the bottom here, so make sure it's nice and straight, and it's going to line up with your shifter up here. Make sure that's pushed over and straight. Grab my drive shaft, start feeding it in. Move this thing back. I'll pick that up so it lines up in the hole. Shifter straight, yep. Make sure my shift mechanism gets in there. Come on. Shifter's still straight. Line up. Okay, so I think I'm going to have to lightly move my splines here. I'm just turning the prop just a little bit.
Just to try and get my splines lined up. Okay. Shifter still straight. Come on. There we go. Now I can go ahead and lightly put on a nut and washer. And I usually try to get it, yeah, I'm not going to get that on. Push it a little bit more. This is why it's nice if the drive falls all the way down. You won't have to fight this. Trying to get it on. You never want to force these on, so you want to make sure, if you have to do what I'm doing, that you're not forcing it on, that it just goes on nicely. And I'm starting to have to force that a little bit. I don't want to do it, but what I'm going to do, I had to get it on so I get the washer on. I'm going to put my washer on, put the nut on just lightly, and then give it another shake because I don't want it to fall back off. That would be a bummer. Get that just on a couple threads. Never want to force these on, ever. Ever, ever. There. So, you see I just shook it on. And so what was happening, what usually holds you up there is those new O-rings in the gimbal housing. So now I'm on. And now I can go ahead and snug these down. So forward should be solid, pushing down to the left. Solid. So I'm in forward still, so that's good. All right, last one, and just remember these don't have to be too tight. There is actually a torque rating to this. I've never torqued them on. So that's in. Now we gotta have a lovely fight here with our trim rams. So this is also why we took them off the way we did and just took the one bolt off of this one bolt off of this one. So now I can take my bolt and washer, there it is, for that side, the bottom, and we're going to slide this through at the top, make sure our big washer with the big hole is still on here. We're going to start to slide this on like that. I'm going to put that down for now. Lift up the drive. Get my end in. Here we go. Fight that sucker on there. All the way up. On the bottom. Okay. Now, we're going to take our big washer, slide it on. Now both rubbers are in this one. Slide this up. Whoosh. Put her on. There we go. Use my shoulder. I can push this one on. Now, gotta be careful it doesn't fall out. Push this one in the bottom. Push that over there, sort of, not. Okay, in-ish. Okay, I'm going to start this top one. So, small washer, nut. Okay. Push this. I can't push it with the pressure from the drive on there. leg under it. Okay, almost. Okay, phew. You got to make that noise too, it helps. Helps when you make that noise. Okay, washer, nut. Now we can tighten those up. Okay, now put your caps back on. And there you go, you're ready to go boating for another season. You have your drive all serviced, everything should be good, and you should have trouble-free boating for the whole season, and hopefully more to come. Again, I like to change the water pump impellers about every 2 to 3 years. And yeah, thanks for watching. Please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and make some comments on here. Tell me what you liked and didn't like. Watch my other videos. Thanks very much, and take care.